Well, I don't have a chair up here today. And part of it is because, man, this last week was hard. And I felt emotional. And I was like, man, if I'm in a chair, I'm going to fidget. And so at least this lets me walk around a little bit. We've been looking at the high place of humanity in creation. We've been looking at God bringing humanity in as the pinnacle of creation, as his image. But we saw last week the cost. We get free will. We get to go shoot up a school if we want. This is the cost. And sometimes the week just hits me hard. I've been around the loss of life for a long time in the military, and it just hits me hard. But what is faith if faith cannot face darkness? A lot of times I think we build faith on these, I want amazing worship. I want this mountaintop experience. I want the amazing feeling. I want to be in an incredible community. But faith has to survive the valleys. Faith has to be able to face darkness, or else it'll die. I think if we don't have a faith that can face darkness, two things will happen. We'll either delude ourselves that the darkness is not really that bad in order to make our faith survive, or we'll lose our faith. I want to begin by telling a few stories today. For those online, if you have a kid watching this directly, parents, these are a little violent. These are darkness stories. And the first story is of a boy who was born to a wealthy family, but they were both alcoholics. His father was extremely abusive. When he would wet the bed, his father would beat him with his own toy airplane. And then he would make him hang in soiled sheets out of the apartment window so everybody would see the shame of what he'd done. When his father would be intoxicated, he would grab his 4-year-old son and hang him out the 4th-story window and say, if you don't be quiet, I'm going to drop you. Where's God? That child was born to wealthy parents. And in school, people would mock him for how he looked. One reason was because of his oddly shaped head. He had fallen out of a tree as a child. And they would mock him for how his head looked. This boy would go on to make multiple suicide attempts through his life. There's a story of another boy. This boy wasn't born to wealthy parents. This boy was born to the poorest family in his county. Many pitied him and his sibling as they were known as the dirtiest kids in town. They always looked dirty. His mom would often send them out without socks and shoes, no matter the weather. When in the 5th grade, his brother stabbed him in the left eye and made him lose his eye. His father had lost both legs, and his father wouldn't work. Wouldn't hold a job. So his mom made ends meet by being a prostitute. And she would prostitute herself in the one-room shack that they lived in while the kids were there. She forced her son to wear women's clothes to school until the county told her she couldn't do it anymore. One day she killed her son's pet mule just to spite him. She would also beat her son with blocks of wood. One day putting her son in a 3-day coma, hitting him so hard. Where's God? The first boy born to wealthy parents, fallen out of a tree with a misshapen head, hung out a 4th-story window by his father, The first boy became a murderer and a rapist. He would be the one who the movie Silence of the Lambs was made after. He would kidnap and rape 6 women, killing 2 of them. Where's God in that? The second boy, born to the poor family, put in a 3-day coma when he was a child. He would become Henry Lee Lucas, one of the most notorious serial killers in America, killing at least 11 known victims, possibly up to or over 100 people. Where's God? 1 in 4 serial killers have suffered brain damage as children. 1 in 3 serial killers were born to alcoholic parents. There's one more story of another boy who grew up in a broken home. He would grow his hair out when he became older because as a child, his parents would shave his hair so short that in school he got the nickname Pelón, Spanish for bald. He would become so bullied in school, he couldn't escape it. He would go to social media and he was being bullied. He would go online to video games to find escape and he would be bullied in those video games. He had a stutter and a lisp and he would be bullied for that. His sexuality would be questioned. His humanity would be questioned. And the hurt inside him would begin to show as he would cut himself. One of his friends remarked about how he would cut his own face. And he would show up with these cuts on his face. The hurt in him began to come out. Until at age 18, the misery of his life ended. But not before he killed 21 people this week. Where's God? Elie Wiesel was a Jew who went to Auschwitz. He was interned in Auschwitz by the Germans. And he would face this question: where's God? In 1944, at the age of 15, he and his family were confined to a Jewish ghetto. A couple months later, they were then shipped off to Auschwitz, where upwards of 90% of new arrivals were immediately executed. In Auschwitz, approximately 1.1 million people were exterminated. Immediately upon getting there, his mother and sister were executed. He and his father were able-bodied, and so they were given jobs to do until they were no longer able-bodied, and then they would be executed. After arriving in Auschwitz, after a short time, he had to listen as his father was beaten to death. Couldn't stop it. So he was liberated in 1945 by Allied forces at 16 as an orphan. He has an amazing memoir. If you ever get a chance if you want to read someone who has insight into suffering and God and all this stuff, he has an amazing memoir. He recounts one story from his time in the concentration camps. The SS had called all the Jewish prisoners to assemble. Thousands of them were assembled in this yard. They lined them up in ranks. Machine guns were pointing inward at the Jews. The machine guns were not protecting the camp. They were pointed inward at the Jews. Thousands of them were assembled. And before these thousands of Jews, there were 3 gallows. And there was 2 men and a child next to the gallows. The 3 prisoners were made to step up on the chairs. 2 men and a little boy. The nooses were placed around their necks. The two men shouted, "Long live liberty." This is something that had come in the camp as a shout of defiance to the Nazis. But the boy just stood there silently with the noose around his neck. Behind Weisel, he heard a voice say, "Where's God?" The chairs were kicked out from under the prisoners. And they hung there. And the same voice behind him said again, "For God's sake, where's God?" Weisel says they heard a voice within him respond, "God is here, that's where. And he's hanging from the gallows." In these two men, we see our choice that lies before us. We see our choice of responses. When we look at the school shooting this week, when he looked at a little boy being hung with two men, our choice is that we can look at this and get angry at God and say, "Where is God? Where are you?" Or we can look and we can say, "I hate this darkness, but God has come into the darkness." We have a choice of what narrative we want to live out. We have a choice of how we want to see things and how we see things. And the story that we look at is the story that we will live out. It's to God joining us here in darkness that I want to look at this week. I did away with my message as the weight of this week just weighed on me. Because we can think, well, we have God here in the church. But then the Southern Baptist Convention comes out this week and they say almost 1,000 sexual predators have been protected by their denomination. Where's God? When I was saved, I was in such a pit of darkness. Suicidal, drugs, alcohol. And suddenly I hear the voice of God, and man, love and peace came into me. I was like, this is amazing. And I go into church and I look around and I'm like, we have this and this is what we have. Even in church, we struggle in. But God has not given up on us. And that's part of the message of these key verses that we're looking at. God placed us in a high place. He knew the risk, and he is committed to see it through. The passage we were going to look at today is 2 Samuel 2:11 through 14. And in this passage, prophet's coming to David. David wants to build a temple to God, and the prophet Nathan comes to David, and he's going to say, "David, you have too much blood on your hands. I don't want you to build my temple." But he does say, "You've done some great work, and I'm going to give you rest. Your reign will enter into a Sabbath time." And God blesses him, even though immediately after this, David goes up and messes everything up with Bathsheba. But what we see in 2 Samuel is Nathan says, "The Lord declares to you that he himself will build a dynastic house for you." What we find is that David says, "I'm going to do this for you, God." And God says, "No, this is my work. I will see it through. I will do it. You sit there. I'm going to take care of this." And Nathan says, as the prophet, "When the time comes for you to die, I will raise up your descendant, one of your own sons, to succeed you, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will make his dynasty permanent. I will become his father, and he will become my son. When he sins, I will correct him with the rod of men and with wounds inflicted by human beings. This is known as the Davidic covenant. Like many prophecies, what's interesting here, what we learn from here is that it has twofold meaning. Its immediate meaning is in Solomon. Solomon will be the one to build the temple. Solomon will be the human being to immediately follow David. But then we also find out in the New Testament that Jesus comes and they say he's one wiser than Solomon. And Jesus fulfills this permanently. And what we see in this Davidic covenant is that despite all our failures as humans, God has committed to do this permanently. God is committed to see things through. Peter picks this up in Acts chapter 2, verses 30 to 31. He grabs onto the Davidic prophecy and he says, "So then, because he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on his throne, David, by foreseeing this, spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned in the grave, nor did his body experience decay." Jesus is the promised son who would come and build a house. In Ephesians 2:21, it tells us, in Jesus, the whole building is joined together, growing into a holy temple. Jesus is building this permanent temple that goes back to the Davidic covenant. And he doesn't give up his plans even when humanity falls into darkness. But he goes into the darkness and he suffers with us. Colossians 1:17 tells us, he himself is, this is talking about God, he himself is before all things, and all things are held together by him. God is existence itself. We considered this several months ago when we looked at I am who I am. What God is essentially saying is, I exist because I exist. I'm the only one whose existence relies on nothing. I am existence itself. In other words, we don't self-exist. I cannot say I am because I am. I exist because I want to exist. That's not how it works. And what Colossians tells us is that God holds everything together. And what that means is that God's existence is in each and every one of us. It's within Ramos, the school shooter, as he grew up and is bullied. By extension of God's existence into Ramos. He suffered as Ramos was bullied. By extension of God's existence, I believe God suffered every time Ramos pulled that trigger. Ramos's pain and suffering first began to be seen by the world as he cut himself. And from there, it just went out more and more into the world. And as much as we want to hate Ramos, what Paul tells us is that we're not wrestling against this kid who by bullying was turned to darkness and was enslaved by darkness. Paul tells us the enemy is the darkness. And I'm left in shock as I look at Ramos, as he killed 21 people. That God left his existence in Ramos until Ramos breathed his last. But thank God he doesn't have a pattern of removing his existence when someone is too far in darkness, because he may have just removed his existence from me when I was also in darkness. Thank God he stuck things out. Even though we see the suffering, even though we see the pain, God stuck with Ramos. That's the same pattern that allowed him to stick with me and see me through my darkness. Horrible things that I've done in my past life. And we can look at Ramos and we can say, there's evil. This is the challenge that I would leave us with today. We look at Ramos and say, there's evil. We can look at Putin and say, there's evil. We look at Russian troops and we say, there's evil. But we have to look at ourselves. As I reflect on things, I currently enjoy my sugary treats every once in a while. I enjoy my Pepsis, my sodas. I enjoy my Snickers bars, my Nestle Crunch bars. I enjoy my sugary treats. Knowing that they increase my risk of heart disease, knowing that they increase my risk of diabetes. But I support these companies who also then take their product and export it to third world countries. Since Pepsi and Coca-Cola and Nestle and these other companies have begun exporting to places like Africa, their heart disease, their diabetes rates have climbed. And they don't have first world healthcare like I do. So I can't say I'm innocent. I can't point to Ramos and say there's evil. When you see other evil things going on in the world, we're exporting heart disease and diabetes to places who do not have the same healthcare that I do. I enjoy my technology. I enjoy my phone. I'm preaching off my iPad here. These are technologies that are all birthed from the cobalt mines of Africa. Horrible. Human slavery. Kids growing up with lung disease. Kids who will grow up to produce their own children with birth defects from exposure to cobalt. So the challenge here, what I would challenge us is empathy. To realize the evil is not Ramos. I don't want to excuse what he did. We all have choices. But the line between good and evil runs through each and every one of us. The line between good and evil is not, look at Ramos over there, I'm not that. I didn't go shoot up a school. We all have the challenge laid out before us to choose. When I face darkness, will I blame God for it, or will I say, thank God he has come into darkness to be with us and to fight it with us?